This lecture, we are rounding up our talk on the big three moral theories with Kantianism, deontology, and this is going to be um, the kind of opposite position that we talked about last time with utilitarianism and the idea of a moral theory being a consequentialist theory, in that the consequence is what matters most. Uh, this time with deontology, it's going to be more about the intent behind an action and whether or not that intent makes sense. So, just a little background on Kant. He lived in the 1700s and was from Germany, Prussia, actually about where St. Petersburg is today. And he grew up in a fairly religious household, didn't really ever leave the city that he grew up in, but has become one of the most influential philosophers since Plato and Aristotle. Now, for Kant, consequences didn't matter. And they didn't matter because, like moral relativism, like egoism, like virtue ethics, these theories um, were often different for different people based on how you evaluate certain things. And Kant thought that morality is something that should be objective, that it should be grounded in logic, and it doesn't matter what religion you come from, it doesn't matter what society or country you grow up in, or even what time period you grow up in. What is right, what is wrong, and that's always how it is. And so Kant really tried to understand morality in terms of universal laws, and a person should obey and respect those laws as a member of the community. Just like if you were to play a sport, you respect the rules of that sport to play the sport. You respect the moral laws because you are a member of the society of the world. And these rules were formed out of the idea that it is illogical, it is irrational to be able to determine what is a good and bad action, what is morally acceptable, and what is morally unacceptable. And so when Kant looks at something like a type of uh, pleasure, pain, utilitarian position, uh, not even pleasure and pain are good independently of, right, like what he referred to as the good will. Pleasure and pain can be used for good or bad, but goodness, like the goodwill, is always good in itself. We'll kind of talk a little bit more about that goodwill a little later. But when we think about that, it seems to make sense, right? Even if a bad person does a good thing, then it benefits the bad person. And so we would think of good actions then not really being actually good in that instance. And so pleasure and pain are not these things that Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill thought of in terms of like these most basic fundamental experiences, um, or at least things that should guide our behavior, because they can be still good or bad based on who's getting the pleasure, who's suffering the pain, and so forth. Um, and so Kant expressed the idea for these types of imperatives. There are two: hypothetical imperative and the categorical imperative. And these are really what guide our behavior. Now, when it comes to morality, it's the categorical imperative that's important, not the hypothetical imperative. Hypothetical imperatives are really just those types of conditions that we express to get us to behave in a certain way. But most behaviors, most actions that you do aren't moral actions, they're just hypothetical imperatives. If you want money, you should get a job. So is getting a job, is that good or bad? Well, Kant's going to say neither. It would be weird to attribute morality to you getting a job. This is just a hypothetical imperative. If you want money, then you should get a job. If you don't want money, then you don't need to get a job. Um, and so most of our actions aren't actually moral actions. And we don't want to necessarily confuse this idea of the uh, hypothetical imperative with just any kind of conditional statements, right? If you want Mexican food, I know this great place, or any if then statement. It's more of just how we justify our behavior. And we all may justify different behaviors differently because we're all different people. But it's the categorical imperatives that really hold us to this moral law. And this categorical imperative is universal, it is objective. And so it plays into every individual from every society and every religion um, across time. And so he expresses this in several formulations. We're only going to talk about the first two. The third and fourth one kind of fall into the first two, so they're not too important for us in this class. But each one of these is meant to be kind of a different way of expressing the same kind of ideas about objective behavior and objective morality. And again, he thinks that this should be based on logic. So that what makes a moral rule moral is the idea that it's following some logical pattern. We are a rational creature that behaves or ought to behave rationally, or we can behave rationally. And so we need to base our actions on that rationality, not on religion, not on social class or status or anything like that. And if we base it on rationality, then no matter what culture you come from or time period, you're always going to get the same types of behaviors being right and wrong. And it's important to note that this is a very complicated, perhaps one of the most complicated, perhaps one of the most misunderstood ideas of morality. And so make sure you're listening along very carefully. So there are the two laws that we're going to talk about. The first is the formula of the universal law. Now, the formula of the universal law states that act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And from this, we can see that if we're being logical, if we're being rational, then the intent of our action should not contradict whatever the outcome of that action is um, meant to exhibit. So, for instance, because intent is what's important with Kant, not consequences. We need to be doing an action for the right reasons. And doing an action for the right reasons simply means doing it logically. So if we take, for instance, the act of stealing, Kant would suggest that stealing is wrong because if we were to universalize the idea of stealing, I would steal something, then someone would steal that from me, then someone else would steal that from the other person and steal that from the other person. This is essentially what Kant is getting to. What he is not saying, and this is important, is he's not saying that because everybody is stealing this object or because everybody steals, no one would want to live in that type of society. It would just kind of break down and create chaos. So stealing is wrong. That is not what he is saying. He's saying that the intent of why you steal has logically contradicted what has happened if you universalize this law. For instance, if I steal something, the intent of my stealing it is to possess this particular object. But then the object is stolen from me. So I never actually obtain the object that I steal. And then someone steals it from me, and their intent is to possess this object, but then it's stolen from them. So nobody actually ever possesses the object. So my entire intent to steal is contradicted by the fact that I don't actually get the thing for which I was intending to steal. So let's say I'm starving and I need a loaf of bread. So I'm going to steal this loaf of bread. Now, I will know that this is morally wrong because if I universalize it, I'm stealing the bread so that I can have food to eat. But before I can eat it, it is then stolen from me. So the act of me stealing the bread in the first place does no good. And my intent is contradicted by the fact that if I universalize this, I never actually get the bread to which I intended to eat. And so if we were to do this with certain moral actions, we would see that good actions are not contradicted, while bad actions are contradicted. And they are bad because of the contradiction. They are good because of not the contradiction. So for instance, if I think of giving money to charity, let's say I'm thinking of whether or not I should give money to charity. If I give money to charity, it'll make me feel good. But the intent behind that, what if I universalize that? So if I give money to charity, it's because it feels good to do it and because it helps the world a little bit better. And then everybody gives money to charity. Does someone else is giving money to charity also contradict the fact that my giving to charity is going to make me feel good and help society? No, it doesn't. In fact, if everybody gave to charity, then the world would probably be a better place. And everybody would feel good. And so this type of action would be a morally good one. It's not one that's negated by the consequence of universalizing these actions. As another example, let's use lying. Let's say I need to tell a lie. I'm coming into work late and I need to make up an excuse and I need to lie so that I don't get in trouble. I need to think then, what if everybody lied? Now remember, it's not that, well, what if everybody lied, then everyone would be a liar and that would just suck. That's not what Kant's saying. What he's saying is that I'm lying to get out of getting in trouble. But if I universalize that and everybody lies, then my lie would then serve no purpose, because when I try to make up an excuse to my boss would think, well, everybody's lying, so he's clearly lying to me right now. And if he thinks that I'm lying to him, then my lying to him is not doing me any favors. It's not doing any good. Right? So lying has contradicted itself, because when we universalize it, the intent is negated by the fact that I wouldn't be believed anyway. And so this way, Kant's able to create this set of rules, create this imperative where we would know what is right or wrong based on whether or not the intent is contradicted by the fact of universalizing whatever it is that we're trying to do. Now, this, of course, isn't without its problems. You still run into the idea where we think about things like, well, what about white lies? What about little lies? Kant's going to say that these little lies are not good. They're morally wrong. But ask yourself, is it always wrong to lie? And so there's a good thought experiment in the little video for this week about the murderer that comes to the couple's house. And so in Kant's example of this, right, he uses the axe murderer. So let's say an axe murderer comes to your house and is looking for your partner. The axe murderer says, "Is your partner home? I'm going to kill him or her." Kant would say, you cannot lie, or you should not lie, because lying is wrong, even if it means to save your partner. Because lying is an act that is morally impermissible. I think most of us would have a hard time with that, though. Clearly, it's the axe murderer that's in the wrong, not necessarily you. You're doing something good. You're protecting everybody. But Kant says it's wrong. And he thinks it's wrong for a couple of reasons. But one of those reasons takes us to the second of his formulas, and that's the formula of the end in itself. And the formula of the end in itself claims that an act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Which means that we need to make sure that we're not treating people as mere meanses. We need to treat them as ends as well. So when I lie to the axe murderer, I am simply treating them as a means to get to the end of there being no murders, right? I'm trying to calm the situation by lying, but in doing so, I take away the autonomy of the axe murderer. Because if the axe murderer busts into the house and kills your partner, it is the axe murderer that is at fault, not you. But when you lie to the axe murderer, you are then taking away the autonomy. You are taking away the decision-making process of that individual. And this Kant thinks is wrong. In addition, if you were to lie to the axe murderer, and then the axe murderer leaves, but at the same time, your partner is running out the house, out the back door, to try and get away because your partner has overheard the conversation. And then the axe murderer and your partner run into each other on the side of the house. Now, this instance is partially your fault. You had a hand in this murder now, rather than just letting the axe murderer be to blame. Now, of course, this doesn't mean you have to welcome in the axe murderer, but you cannot lie. And if you do, you are doing something wrong. But again, we also think to instances where we think, well, little white lies are sometimes good. If my child asks me if I know something and I can tell, oh, he just learned something in school, he really wants to tell me what it is, and obviously I know the answer, but I want him to tell me because I want him to feel like he's accomplished something. I want him to feel good about imparting information. So I lie and say, no, I don't know. Tell me. And then he tells me. Is that necessarily morally wrong to do that? Or would some consider that just good parenting? Should we say that we always need to tell the truth to our kids? Like, yes, I know that. Everything you tell me for the next 18 years, I know that. So don't bother telling me anything for the next 18 years. Right? That would seem a little bit awkward. That would seem bad in some way. And so, while out of the theories that we've looked at over the last few weeks, it would seem as though this is by far the most rule-guided, strict to follow. It's the cleanest. But at the same time, it seems to present just as many problems and seems to make a lot out of small things that we wouldn't necessarily even consider being moral decisions. But the difficulty here with all of these theories is behaving in a way that focuses on one. Because if we were to use multiple theories, we'd often be inconsistent, giving the wrong message, and that would make things very difficult. Again, take for instance a business or a corporation. If the boss of the business or the CEO in one instance acts very utilitarian to save as many employees as possible, but then on the other hand acts deontologically by doing what is right logically, then what type of message does that send? How should we know how to act in certain situations? And if we're continually acting in different ways for different circumstances, we've essentially just reduced ourselves or the corporation to moral relativism or egoism, which on the outset was again a pretty bad theory because of the subjectivity involved. So it's important to really find a good theory to use consistently and that will boast the best results.